Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Testing it out. Is that Izzy or Samara up there? Samara. See if I can look at the camera properly. Jess, Bud Rainbow, Beth, good to see you. Bud, Beth, is it snowing there? Because you guys were like going to get hammered with snow. We've gotten a whole bunch of rain. They said you guys were going to get some snow. Oh boy, it's warm in here. I'll be right back. I'm going to take my sweatshirt off because it's already toasty. There we go. Jim, I talked to Jeremy. He wants to get lunch at some point while he's here. He's going to be, I'm picking him up Wednesday at 11 a.m. that week, and then he's going to be here through till Monday evening. He's got to be in, his flight leaves Buffalo at 5:30 on Monday, so. Raining most of the day, Beth? Okay. Yeah, we're going to be a bit busy. I said just picking him up and getting him out of the airport and I think we'll probably hit a wing place.
I got my retiree's breakfast last Wednesday of the month.
We'll probably hit a wing place on the way home.
Other than that, I cleared my calendar for that weekend.
Yeah, I know, you told me. He's going to get promoted.
What?
He's getting promoted to be the director of Center for Holy Land Studies.
That's good.
So I guess that starts Monday from what he told me today. And he also told me he writes the material, but he doesn't do the discussion questions. That's the when they send it down to publishing, they're the ones that do that. So
Well, a couple of days ago, I got a thing on my phone, 2 years ago today. I was touring downtown Istanbul.
oh yeah, that's right. It was in the spring, wasn't it? It was before. It was just before Easter that year, wasn't it?
Palm Sunday,
Yeah.
which was the middle of April.
Everyone's in here, stay healthy over Easter weekend because a whole bunch of people got sick. There's a lot of puking going on Easter weekend. Jay, and I know Terry now got it. She's got it. That's why they're not here tonight. Travis and Raina. Raina had it Sunday. Now Travis has got it. It's like... Don't have time for that? Went to the Sabres game last night. They scored 6 goals. It was awesome. They scored 3 goals in 2.5 minutes in the third period. I was loving life at that moment. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool 2.5 minutes right now. Yeah, 6-2. Yeah. Yeah, they hammered them. Well, let's get started, shall we? Page 49. Page 49. This is lesson number 9 in the life of Jesus, and it's talking about the trial of Jesus. And you're going to find in the material, it talks about it later, like the 18 hours from the arrest of Jesus to crucifixion is probably the most written about moment of his life, and rightfully so. In the suffering and all the events that kind of led into it. And you're going to find tonight, as we're talking about this as a trial, how we talked about a lot of corruption in the last lesson last week before Easter, and kind of the corruption of the Jewish system at that moment in time, in the temple tax and everything else that was going on. And now we'll talk about the trial of Jesus, and the corruption doesn't stop. So, top of page 49, we'll start reading here. Of the entire life and ministry of Jesus, no segment of time is described in more detail by the gospel writers than the final 18 hours of his life. Many other well-known moments are recorded, but only some of the authors, like his birth, his teaching in the temple at 12 years old, and the Sermon on the Mount. However, all 4 Gospels similarly record Jesus' betrayal, trial, and death. I want you to underline that last sentence. All 4 Gospels record Jesus' betrayal, trial, and death. Now, not all 4 of the Gospels are written by Hebrews. I want you all to understand that. Luke was not a Hebrew. He was a Gentile, but he was a trained physician, okay? Matthew, definitely a Hebrew. John, definitely a Hebrew. Mark, not sure, they think, probably a Hebrew, but wasn't one of the disciples. This was accounts that he was getting, and Mark did most of his travels with Paul the Apostle. So, as we're talking about this, it's really important that you understand that this 18-hour period, Jesus' betrayal, his trial, and his death, is written in all 4 Gospels. And in the Jewish mind, a lot of times when they're putting things together, repetitive nature of things adds emphasis. It's not repetitive for not repetitive sake. When they say something 3 times, it's similar to English when we say something low and then when we say something louder, or we put an emphasis of pause on it. It's the same idea as them saying something 3 times. They're adding emphasis to what they're saying. And so this should really break through to you and how important this was to the gospel writers, this window of time. In our familiarity, next paragraph, in our familiarity with the narrative, we may fail to catch some of its most important elements, but the details help us more fully understand what was taking place in these critical moments of human history. Now, I want you to start underlining here all the way to the end of the paragraph. One aspect of Holy Week that is often overlooked is Jesus' trial. Why? Because the term trial is not the best descriptor for the travesty that unfolded that night. Trial implies a search for evidence, truth, and justice. But that was not the religious leaders' objective on the night Jesus was betrayed. Okay? So again, when this is referred to as a trial, what you're going to find in the process of us doing this study tonight is that it really wasn't even a trial. And what was done to Jesus was tantamount to a lynching. It was a yo-yo, it was a kangaroo court, basically. And then the Jews that were in leadership, Caiaphas, Annas, And the Sanhedrin at the time, or the leaders of it, not all of the Sanhedrin, you can't accuse all of them of it, basically tried to use the Roman government to do their dirty work. You're going to see this come out. Jeremy's going to talk about it in the video, and we'll talk about it further when we study. So I'm going to turn the video on, and you guys can see it from there.
Under the cloak of darkness, after his arrest by the temple guards on the orders of the Sanhedrin priests, Jesus was dragged across the Kidron Valley to the homes of the priests. He was brought there to answer for his supposed crimes. He was met by the former high priest Annas and the current high priest Caiaphas and their allies. Jesus was brought inside the confines of the house, seemingly leaving only John as the witness to these events. John was allowed only because of the prominence of his family and that his father Zebedee was known to Caiaphas. Peter was left outside waiting for any news. Though often this action is called the trial of Jesus, by Jewish law, there was no trial. It was nothing more than a small mob of angry elites who were opponents of Jesus. Who were a part of this mob? Who were these opponents of Jesus? As noted, we find that chief among them was the family of the high priest and the leaders of the Sadducean party. It was their allies, the wealthy priests and scribes, who were profiting off of the Roman rule and their control of the temple. This would have given them the power to take Jesus as they had done in the Garden of Gethsemane. They hated Jesus, as he proved to serve as a direct threat to their power derived from their wealth, gained off of the temple. They were charged inflated prices for sacrificial elements, and they were forced to use money that benefited the temple elites rather than the people. Only a few days prior, Jesus, witnessing this as he had for years, flipped their tables over and publicly called them out for all to see, showing the people that their actions against their Jews and more importantly against God would bring judgment upon them. It was at that point that they knew they needed Jesus to be out of the picture. Out of the four Gospels, only John's Gospel included anyone other than the Sadducees as part of this mock trial of Jesus on that final night. John includes some of the Pharisees. However, they noticeably vanish from the narrative by the time Jesus was taken elsewhere. The events that transpired that night would not have been historically in line with how the Pharisees held to the law of God. Only a stone's throw away from where I'm standing right now, Jesus faced false accuser after false accuser. These were men who gave what would be condemning claims about the character and ministry of Jesus. As this was not a full convening of the governing body of the Sanhedrin, which should have been made up of both Sadducees and Pharisees, the Sadducees, by law, lacked the true ability to execute Jesus. Yet, they found their way. These leaders, who for the past few generations had snuggled up close to Rome, knew their imperial overlords could do something that they couldn't: execute their enemy Jesus. Then Rome would absorb the blame with a minimal backlash to the Sadducees. They took Jesus from the location into the night to their Roman authority, Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate served as the prefect of the Roman province of Judea. A prefect was a military commander who served as the primary authority over an unstable region of the Roman Empire. As prefects were not the traditional politicians, their tactics of enforcing Roman authority often relied on intimidation and violence rather than communication and negotiation. Pilate was no different. Numerous historical accounts, both Jewish and Roman, paint the picture of Pilate as a bloodthirsty leader, one who would assert his dominance and control in the region to better position himself in the graces of Caesar, no matter what the cost. Many times, the blood of Pilate's Jewish subjects was needlessly spilled, sometimes being done so in connection with his attempts to honor Caesar, with who he seemed desperate to befriend. Knowing this, Pilate became an easy target for the schemes of the Sadducean leaders, using Pilate's aggression and weakness against him. There was a custom of Roman leaders of the region to execute revolutionaries and Messiah figures in the days surrounding the celebration of Passover, as this was a feast commemorating the removal of the children of Israel out from under the foreign oppression of the Egyptians. They executed people to remind the Jews that no matter what they were celebrating, they would remain under the foreign oppression of Rome. The Sadducean leaders knew that if they brought Jesus to Pilate, pegging Jesus as one who opposed Caesar, Pilate would be willing to do the rest of the dirty work for them. The Sadducean leaders arrived at the palace of Herod the Great, where Pilate was staying in Jerusalem, where I'm standing right now. Pilate realized that although Jesus was in his territory at the moment, in Judea, Jesus was a Galilean, and therefore under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. Luke's gospel tells us that Pilate sent Jesus to Antipas, who was in Jerusalem for the Jewish high holy day. However, though once fearing Jesus as he had feared John the Baptist, Antipas ridiculed a silent Jesus. After he had his soldiers beat him, he sent him back to Pilate, effectively relinquishing his priority of authority over the punishment of Jesus. Upon the return of Jesus to Pilate, Pilate sent Jesus to be scourged, which was an act of brutalizing one's flesh mercilessly at the hands of a cat of nine tails, an act which many did not walk away from alive. Some have speculated that this act was a way for Pilate to quickly kill Jesus without blame, for if he died during the process, it was the fault of his soldiers. Too often, the church has given Pilate a free pass due to what is seemingly perceived as a reluctance of want for the death of Jesus. However, much of this rests in the way that we today read the accounts. Based on the account of those who lived in the first century, Pilate is rarely displayed as one of mercy and almost always as mocking and antagonistic. If we take this lens and then we read Pilate's words once more with a shade of contempt, his statements align far closer to the Pilate of history rather than the character of Pilate canonized by certain branches of the church. In addition to having Jesus flogged, though he found no guilt in Jesus, Pilate offered the Sadducean leaders the choice, Barabbas or Jesus. As it did not matter to Pilate which figure died, he left it to the Jewish leaders. Following the choice of Barabbas to be set free, Pilate washed his hands of the incident and sent Jesus to be executed by means of crucifixion upon a cross. Even still, when the events of that night are put in perspective, the destiny of Christ was to die regardless as a result of the wickedness and sin that can be found in the hearts of all people. Although the fate of Christ appears to have been left to these men, the realities of Scripture point us to the truth that Christ's fate was sealed long before that night, all the way back to the days of the Garden of Eden. It is there, in Genesis 3:15, where we find the initial promise of the defeat of sin and death that plagues each and every one of us at this terrible yet glorious cost.
All right. Did anything stand out to anyone about this? Struggling tonight, huh, Jim? Struggling tonight with the coughing, huh?
I think it's withdrawal. I got a rental vehicle, I can't smoke in it.
Gotcha. Anything stand out? How about you folks online? Anything stand out to you? I think he said something right there toward the end that as the church, we've kind of given Pilate a pass in a lot of ways. Because we act like he was trying to find a way to get out of crucifying Jesus. And it says that he didn't find him to be guilty of anything, but history tells a much different picture of who Pilate was. He was a very aggressive and bloodthirsty man as a Roman prefect. And so if you put that lens over some of the things that he said about Jesus and how he treated the Jewish leadership with contempt, then you get probably a clearer picture of the way Pilate was. He didn't have any problem putting Jesus to death. In fact, he had done it a number of times without even proper ceremony. Let's see, Jess said everyone wanted it, but no one wanted the blame. Yeah. I want to challenge or push back on that a little, Jess, because I think that not everyone wanted it. I think there was a small elite group of people who wanted it because Jesus threatened their way of holding on to their power and their money, and they put all those wheels in motion. So let's look at, and Beth said, that's what I was going to say. I always thought Pilate was reluctant, right? Yeah, he wasn't. He was aggressive. I mean, you can see that he tries to shuffle the blame off a number of times by sending Jesus to Herod and then, scourging him, hoping that, Jesus would die in the scourging. The Bible doesn't come out and say that, but it's certainly not a leap to get there to think about that because those were the kind of politics that were played at that time. So let's go back to page 49, or right after the video where it says, the reality of the situation is simple. I want you to underline this. Under both Jewish and Roman law, Jesus did not receive a trial. Jesus did not receive a trial. As I said to begin, it was more like a kangaroo court. It was predetermined, guilty until proven innocent type situation. Okay? The next paragraph on page 49 says, in the Jewish world, the authoritative body that ruled on matters of the law was known as the Great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin was comprised of 71 elders from the sects of Judaism, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Now, it doesn't get into it here, but I'm going to get into it with you so you guys understand a little bit better what's going on. Pharisees and Sadducees, even though they were both supposedly experts in the law, they had very different viewpoints on how the law was interpreted, okay? I'm going to say it to you like this. The Pharisees were probably a lot closer to the church, the evangelical church today than any other group. They believed in the Word of God, they believed in the law, and they believed in the literal interpretation. They took the law as history, and they understood it to be what it was, and that it needed to be interpreted in that way. That doesn't mean they didn't try to bend things. But the Sadducees were very different. The Sadducees were a group, they were more very, very liberal in their interpretation of the law. They didn't believe in the supernatural. They really believed that a lot of the Torah, even though it was law, but the stories of it were tantamount to legend and myth, and their interpretation was allegorical more than it was literal. And even in the church today, you find those types of people who they believe the Word of God is the Word of God. It's the literal Word of God. The things that are in it happened. And if the things in it happen, then God is real and He still moves and He still works. And then there's a camp of people who believe that the Bible is nothing more than a book of stories and good principles, and it should be interpreted allegorically. And, you know, we don't have to follow everything it says, but it's a good guide for life, okay? And I'm saying that so you understand the two mentalities of the groups of people. Pharisees have gotten a bad rap with the church. It's easy for us to say things like that because there was a few of them that were bad, but honestly, Pharisees were probably more people of faith than anybody else. The real sect that was kind of after Jesus was Sadducees, because they're the ones that had set up the whole power base with making money through the temple tax. And when Jesus attacks that power base or threatens that power base, I wouldn't say he attacked it, I mean, kick the money tables over, take that as an attack if you want, I guess. But when Jesus confronts that, the Sadducees start putting their plans in action. Now, it doesn't really say if Caiaphas or Annas were Sadducees or Pharisees. I've never seen that anywhere. Most of the time, the high priest was Pharisee, but there was Sadducees as well that sat in that seat. So I'm telling you guys all this so you understand the two mentalities that really comprise the Jewish leadership of the day. And so when they're attacking this, what they perceive as a problem, you got to understand who is really coming at them and why they're navigating the politics of this the way they are, right? The Sanhedrin was comprised of 71 elders from the sects of Judaism, Pharisees and Sadducees. The members were to act as a united body in matters regarding God's law. The Sanhedrin was the authority on not only the prophets and the writings, the entire Old Testament except the Torah, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but also the oral law or the traditional Jewish code of conduct passed down from generation to generation. This next part I'd like you to underline. The Pharisees and Sadducees' theological differences sometimes resulted in long, drawn-out trials ending in stalemate. Do we have any of those in our modern day? Pretty much every court case goes to trial, you can figure on a year, right? Rescheduling court dates, kicking things down the road, it happens all the time. Guys, it's nothing new. They've been doing it for a long time with the lawyers and the law stuff, okay? So for example of this, Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 11, describes Paul, this is the Apostle Paul, intentionally dividing the Sanhedrin at his own trial, causing a debate over the issue of resurrection that became so heated it led to a mistrial. However, Jesus' case was handled very differently. Now, a couple things about this. I want you all to know. Paul was a Pharisee, but Paul was also a Roman citizen. So his trial that happens in Acts chapter 23 is very different than the trial of Jesus, because the Jewish leadership really couldn't go after Paul in the way they normally would if they were trying to just broom him out. Because of Paul's Roman citizenship, he had to be tried by Romans in a fair trial. Because everyone, if they executed him in any way, everyone, because of Paul's citizenship, could be executed and the leadership could be taken down for that by the Roman government. And Paul, being an expert in the law and also understanding the arena, now I'm not saying this is any fault on Jesus, but it's interesting to see that Paul starts the debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees because he knows the weak point to hit him at, right? He starts talking about resurrection. It's a supernatural thing. The Pharisees are going to go, well, resurrection is real, because you can read the Old Testament multiple times. People are brought back from the dead. Where the Sadducees, when they read the Old Testament, they don't think that's real. So now there's a debate on hand, and Paul knows, and he puts the whole Sanhedrin in a tizzy over his court case, and it causes a mistrial. He knew what he was doing, people, all right? Paul was an extremely intelligent person. The Babylonian Talmud, this is the second paragraph on page 50. We will get to discussion questions, I promise. The Babylonian Talmud a complex commentary on Jewish law, was compiled in written form about 400 years after the New Testament. However, the principles in it had been in place for centuries, including during Jesus' life on earth. In a discourse on the rules and operation of the great Sanhedrin, the Talmud states, in cases of monetary law, the court may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling even on the same day, whether to exempt the accused or to find him liable. In cases of capital law, the court may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling even on the same day to acquit the accused, but must wait until the following day to find him liable. Therefore, since capital cases might continue for 2 days, the court does not judge cases of capital law on certain days, neither on the eve of Shabbat nor the eve of the festival. Sanhedrin 32a-8. Now, I want you to underline that last part where it says, therefore, since capital cases might continue 2 days. That's really important because essentially what this is saying, by their own law, that Jesus should not have been tried, as the day that they took him in was the beginning of the festival, and his execution was done on the day before Shabbat. That's why the Pharisees went to the Roman soldiers and asked them to break the legs of Jesus and the 2 prisoners so that they could get the bodies down before the Passover celebration, okay? So I want to read, I have a question for you guys, and I want you to answer this. When we read all the laws, what does it say about this leadership? What does it say about this Jewish leadership? We got a real group of talkers in here tonight, huh?
They had good respect for holy days.
You said they have great respect for holy days. Kathy says they're very corrupt. But when we read this law, what does it say about them? Come on, some more responses, people. We just read their own Sanhedrin law. They did things in a hurry. Trying to tie it all up in the same day. Beth says they were going to hang on to their power at all costs. You got some people bobbing their heads for that. Kathy says they were more interested in their money coming in than the law. This leads to a second question. Did these men actually believe in the law? Erica says she doesn't think so. Jim says it depends. Depends on what?
It depends on how they wanted to turn out.
How they wanted things to turn out. So does that mean they actually believe in the law? No, they don't. Will they use it for their own gain? 100%. Yep. Jess says they're willing to bend the law to their own benefits. You know, in this case, they didn't bend the law, they broke it. Straight up. There was no bending. They broke the law. There was no interpretation of this where they didn't break it. That's what made this so intense in regards to that Jesus didn't even get a trial. Okay? So let's keep reading at the top of page 51. It says, Matthew's description of Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin indicates it could not have been a formal meeting. Although there were representatives present from each of the groups that comprised the Sanhedrin, not all members of the council were in attendance. Underline this, please. The religious leaders questioning of Jesus was illegal for several reasons. Now, I put stars next to these. You can underline everything coming after this. But this is really important for us to understand why what they did to Jesus was not only illegal, but completely corrupt and underhanded. Number one, the trial took place under the cloak of darkness rather than in daytime. Very clear in Jewish law that trials were supposed to happen in daylight. That way, witnesses and leadership who made the judgment could be seen and known that they were the ones that were doing it. Under the shroud of darkness, you wouldn't be able to see who the witnesses were or who was doing the judging. Second thing, the trial was not held in the Sanhedrin's halls in the temple, but in the high priest's house. It's like this. You get a speeding ticket. You weren't speeding. I had this happening one time. I was going to the gym, and I had my seatbelt on, and a police officer pulled me over and gave me a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt. And I looked at him and I said, "Can't you see this?" He goes, "No, you weren't wearing that. You did that after I pulled you over." I said, "No, I was wearing it the whole time." He says, "No, you weren't." I said, "Yeah, I was." He goes, "Well, you're getting a ticket." I said, "Okay, I'll see you in court." He didn't show up to court. I did. You know what happened? Judge threw it out. But what would have happened if I had to show up at the judge's house and not the court in Johnstown, New York? Or if I had to show up to the police station and not the court in Johnstown, New York? I would have been paying a seatbelt ticket, everybody. We understand what's going on? There's a reason that these things happen. Even in our American law, there's a reason that these laws are in place. Do we agree with all of them? No. But there's reasons for them. Third thing, Jesus' trial and crucifixion took place during the festival of Passover and carried over into the eve of Shabbat, John chapter 19, verse 31. Clearly, we can see from what we just read, it breaks the rules of the Sanhedrin, okay? Here's another part for all of you, because we're getting some history, some Jewish history that we're not getting from the Bible, right? And it says, the Sanhedrin rarely considered the death penalty, let alone carried it out. The Mishnah, a record of the oral law that was in effect during the New Testament time, says, a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal. Since the Sanhedrin would subject the testimony to exacting scrutiny, it was extremely rare for a defendant to be executed. Some say this categorization applies to a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 70 years. Still others say if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, we would have concluded trials in a manner whereby no person would have ever been executed. So in every, even in, what do the courts now call it? Precedent, right? Isn't there precedent from previous court decisions that judges take into consideration when they're making judgments? This was completely outside of precedent set by Sanhedrin, so that everyone kind of understands what's going on. In the eyes of the Jewish Sanhedrin, this would have been a terrible, terrible tribunal. The leadership failed utterly in their mind. Erica, someone just walked in the nursery. Oh yeah, John's in there. Yep. After the questioning of Jesus, the chief priests had already made up their mind to have Jesus executed. Mark chapter 14, verse 62 through 64. Remember what I said earlier? Guilty till proven innocent? This is what was going on in this case. Now, let's finish this paragraph and then I'll ask the question I have written down. I'm sorry. I'm tripping over my own notes tonight. However, now, the men of the ruling body who had gathered that night faced an even greater obstacle, Roman law. Only Roman prefects or procurators could mete out capital punishment. Any executions that took place after someone was convicted in the Sanhedrin were illegal, usually carried out by mobs via the traditional Jewish method of stoning. This appears to be the case when Stephen was stoned in Acts chapter 7, verse 54 through Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Okay? Now, Jeremy talked about this a little bit, so I want to ask you this question, and let's have a little discussion over this. Did you ever think, when you're looking at the whole system, and you know the Romans have power, did you ever think that the Jewish religious leaders were actually using the Roman government too at the same time? Did that thought pass any of your minds? That one blew my mind, but it's true. You can see it happen, and that's where politics get really slippery, right? It's easy for us to miss things when so much of this stuff is kind of slithering around in darkness. The next part, at the bottom of page 51, I want you to underline this. If the religious leaders executed Jesus illegally, they could have been charged with sedition for usurping Roman authority. In addition, the populace would have considered them to be Jesus' murderers, a reality they apparently wanted to hide. Continue on this last part on page 52. So they found a way to avoid due process and manipulate someone else to carry out their illegal judgment. Why do we have due process? Anybody? Why do we have due process in our country? To keep everything legal, yes. What else? Say it again, Jim.
Keep it fair for everybody.
To keep everything fair, right. What else? To make sure no mistakes are made in the process. Can you imagine what would happen if capital punishment was put on someone and then they found out a year later that their process was wrong and the person was actually innocent? Yeah, it has. And what happens to the government legally when those things occur? They have to pay big time. How about people who go to prison for years and then they're found to be innocent? You know, they sue the government and get millions of dollars because they served an unlawful prison sentence. Walter says due process is there so everyone is treated equal. And just so you all understand, Jesus is getting no due process here. Nothing is done well. Next paragraph on page 52. As the Roman prefect over Judea, Pontius Pilate was the leading authority in the land, but he still had to make careful decisions that benefited his Roman superiors and his own political interests. When Jesus was brought before him, Pilate faced a conflict of interests. Conflicting political interest. Sound familiar, anyone? I think President Biden has been in some of that recently, hasn't he? Well, with his initial support of Israel, it put him in real conflict with some of the support that he has from Muslims within the Democrat Party. I'm not choosing one side or the other. What I am saying is this: conflict of political interest is not a new thing. It's been going on for thousands of years. Dictators and rulers have had to manage this for a very long time. And Pontius Pilate was no different. But I want to say this to you all, and Jeremy talked about it in the video. Prefects were generally soldiers who had no political experience. I want everyone to understand that. They were put in charge as soldiers, but it was a political position, and they had no political training. They had no diplomatic training whatsoever. So most of the tactics that they used to keep the populace in line was fear of bloodshed and bloodshed. Everyone get that? And so you have a man in Pontius Pilate who has a very volatile place. Judea was very volatile. For the few hundred years before this, there's this thing called the Maccabean rebellions, where the Jews were constantly rising up and freeing themselves from the Romans, and the Romans would come and stomp them even harder, okay? And it ended in 70 A.D. when the temple is completely destroyed by the Romans and all the Jews get deported, okay? But this happened in cycles. Pilate knows that he has a populace that's ready to go into an uprising immediately. A very charged environment, sitting on a powder keg, a TNT block. And so he doesn't want to light the fuse, particularly if Jesus is well-liked and popular. Does everyone understand that now? Like, are we starting to see the weave of intrigue going on? But then you've got Jewish leaders who Jesus is threatening their power base and their wealth and their money, and they're inciting the Romans against him at the same time. And Pilate is just trying to play the shell game, and like a politician, he's trying to shovel the blame off onto someone else. When you read this versus reading the Bible, what's your first thought of Pilate? Pontius Pilate, what do we think about him? Go ahead, Jan. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he had some respect for God, because if he didn't, he wouldn't try to put the blame on. I think he was afraid something would happen to him if he did Jesus in.
He was afraid something was going to happen to him. And I think, as we read the New Testament, there was a personal stake in this too, because his wife has a dream about Jesus, and she goes to him and says, "Don't hurt this man." Yeah. Right? So here's Pontius Pilate, who's a bloodthirsty man, and he's caught in this web of political intrigue, which generally he hits with a hammer, right? He's not really, Pontius Pilate was not known as someone who was a real diplomat. He was a bloodthirsty soldier. He killed his way out of these kind of things. And so this man, who's not used to this, with no training and all kinds of political intrigue, Walter, okay, so Walter says this, he goes, politician. He's a politician. Pontius Pilate's a politician. Yeah, because he's trying to put the blame off on other people and still make himself look good. Jeremy said something in the video, too, that I think was really interesting, is that Pilate was constantly trying to become Caesar's friend. And so by taking such a volatile part of the world, part of the Roman Empire, and keeping it calm, he was trying to win favor with Rome so that one day when he went back there, he would have higher position within the empire. Anybody else online want to talk about, when you read the Bible, what it says about Pontius Pilate, and then we get a few more details filled in from what Jeremy said about him and reading here. Do the two measure up? All right, we're going to soldier on, everybody. Page 52. Everyone is tired or quiet tonight. On the one hand, it's not uncommon for local Roman leaders to act without trial. And anyone who claimed to be a king would have been a traitor in the eyes of Rome. Isn't that what they tried to accuse Jesus of before him? That Jesus said he was the king of the Jews? And that was what was eventually put as his charge when he was crucified. Yeah, Kathy says Pontius Pilate wanted to work his way up the line. Probably. Jesus did not hold Roman citizenship like the Apostle Paul later did, Acts chapter 16. So Jesus did not have the privilege of Rome's protection. And although executions without trials were illegal under Roman law, even for non-citizens, now I want you to underline this next part, that statute was commonly overlooked. In fact, first century sources not only attest to the frequent unjust executions, but even name Pilate as being one of the worst perpetrators of this. So what does that tell us about this case? %, Jan. The Sanhedrin was trying to use him because of his aggression and bloodthirstiness. They thought he would be easy to manipulate. And they said, well, he kills people anyway, so we'll just bring him to Pilate. We can wash our hands of it, and we can blame him for Jesus' death to the populace. Right? It shows you the kind of people that the Jewish leadership was. It also shows you the oddity of the case that they brought before Pilate, that he didn't just kill him. Pilate questions Jesus himself. Do you really think that he questioned prisoners all the time when he executed them? He didn't care. He just killed them. Ask questions later, right. So this next part after, it's still in that paragraph on page 52, specifically, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria describes Pilate's briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, and wanton injuries, executions without trial, constantly repeated, ceaseless, and supremely grievous cruelty. Unjust executions were apparently a part of Pilate's normal way of ruling Judea. First paragraph on page 53. But on the other hand, Pilate believed Jesus was innocent. Despite the claims of the chief priests and Sadducees, Pilate proclaimed, I find nothing wrong with this man. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. Luke chapter 23, verse 4 and verse 15. As Roman prefect, Pilate had the authority to release the prisoner at any time. Nevertheless, and underline this next part, Pilate chose to pacify the crowd. He bypassed proper proceedings and ordered that Jesus be tortured despite his innocence, first by scourging, then by crucifixion. And Jeremy brought up kind of a layer of intrigue in the video that I thought was really interesting. This interested me, is that a lot of people didn't survive scourgings. See, Jesus was scourged 39 times, okay? Really, the way they said it was 40 save 1, meaning the regular sentence was 40, or their thought was that a human body could withstand 40 scourgings. At 40 was the limit where they would die. Everyone understand that? And so 39 was literally all the way to the limit. That was as bad of a scourging as you could possibly get. They didn't have to give you 39, but they couldn't go any higher than 39 because it wasn't supposed to be a capital punishment in terms of death. It was a capital punishment in terms of maiming. Hey, Jennifer Hetrick, how are you? Dad's here with me. Dad says hi. Beth said he killed the two thieves on either side of Jesus. Yeah, he did. He crucified them, but again, that was to appease, when you think about the two thieves and Jesus, that was done to appease the Jewish leadership. See, Pontius Pilate was still playing the shell game of trying to keep everyone happy, but still at the same time accept no blame for their deaths. And all of this was done wrong, and on top of that, the capital punishment of crucifixion was done on the day of a festival and the day before Shabbat, which means it was illegal all the way through. Not for Romans, but by Jewish law it was. And the Jewish leaders go to Pontius Pilate and they say, listen, we don't want those dead bodies for Shabbat the next day during the celebration. Take them down. The thieves were killed, but they were killed because their legs were broken, so then they could no longer push themselves up to breathe. That's just the reality of crucifixion and asphyxiation to a cross, okay? So let's keep going. on page 53. It says, Pilate's actions qualify as one of the most significant miscarriages of justice the world has ever known. Underline this next part, please. He condemned to death a man who was not only innocent of the crime for which he was on trial, but was also innocent of any crime. Jesus alone has walked the earth as a human without committing sin. As a result, he should never have felt the sting of death. Romans chapter 6, verse 23. Think about that for a second. He didn't even break the Jewish law. Forget Roman law. He didn't even break Jewish law. It was a kangaroo court. And he couldn't get justice with the Jewish leaders, and he didn't get justice with the Roman leaders that were over them. How many of you really believe that was the devil's setup job all the way through? He wanted Jesus dead. He didn't know it would be his undoing.
So did we.
Right? Yeah.
We still do.
Yeah, by our sin, right, Jim? Is that what you're saying? Yep. All right, middle of page 53. In our discussion of injustice of Jesus' trial and execution, we should also note the lack of justice being carried out for us. Everyone has sinned, Romans chapter 3, verse 23, which means we were hopelessly separated from God's presence for eternity. He is holy, and he cannot tolerate wickedness. The eternity of suffering for which we were designed would have been true justice, the fitting punishment for our choice to rebel against our Creator. Now, I put a star next to this next paragraph because I think the whole paragraph is important, okay? So the most scandalous miscarriage of justice in history was twofold. The just punishment that awaited us was unjustly placed on Jesus. He willingly accepted it out of love for each person his Father created. We should have paid the price for our sin instead of Jesus. We deserved execution, but Jesus willingly chose to undergo a baseless trial on our behalf, knowing full well it would lead to the cross. Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. When I read that, how does that make you feel? Jim says grateful. Anybody else? Waiting. How does it make you feel? Have you ever felt guilty? Guilty of your sin? Probably a better question to start with, right? You ever felt guilty of your sin? Anybody? After the fact? Jess says sad, makes her feel sad. Kathy says thankful and amazed. I was a youth pastor, and this girl that I had been at this church for 3 years at this point. And when she started with me, she was in 11th grade. She was in 10th grade. And so she was a senior. She was 18 years old. And she had talked bad about me behind my back to people, because she got mad because I wouldn't let her do something in youth group that she wanted to do. It wasn't right. The timing wasn't right. I explained this to her. I took the time to do it. But she still got angry at me. And she stopped coming for a while. And I, as a leader, a lot of times, and especially as a pastor, you kind of want to pat people on the back. Be like, oh, I'm so sorry. It's okay. But as a leader, you can't do that because you have to consider the ramifications on the rest of the group. And so I let her go. Can I say this to you? It's okay that people go. It's okay. We're not here to hold people hostage to church. Can I get an amen? Okay, no one wants to say everyone wants to hold people hostage? Yeah, that's what we're doing? Well, not while I'm pastor, okay? I want you to be here, and I want you to want to be here. But I'm not going to hold a gospel gun to your head and tell you got to stay. Just not going to do it. It's not Jesus' way, and it's not what I'm going to do. And it doesn't help you grow in your walk with God. A couple months go by, she doesn't come to youth group. One day I get a knock on my office door, it was kind of odd because the secretary usually would let me know someone was coming through to my office. And I open the door, and it's this girl, Ashley. And she comes in and sits in front of my desk. And I sit down and I say, how can I help you? And she goes, Pastor, I have to apologize to you. And I said, okay. And she goes, I know you don't know this, but I talked really bad about you to a bunch of people. And I was like, okay. And she goes, I have to apologize. I said, okay, well, get to it. You know what I mean? Like, you want to apologize, let's go. And she goes, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have done it. Will you forgive me? And I said, yep, done. And she goes, and she kind of breathed real heavy, and she sat back, and she looked at me, and she goes, I want you to know this is the first time in my life that I've ever apologized for anything. At 18. Now, folks, I would think that was amazing. But as I've gotten older in ministry, I realized something. There's a lot of people that don't apologize for nothing, ever. And it destroys your walk with God and your ability to really understand Him, okay? We have to be able to apologize. And it starts with asking forgiveness from Jesus for our sin and understanding very much that we were wrong. I'm saying all that to say this. We need to feel the guilt of our sin because that conviction kicks that in. We also need to feel the forgiveness of Christ. And this is a part where I think some people jump off the train, and it's this. They feel like they can redeem themselves by the good actions that they do. That's not possible. Jesus is the Redeemer. The good actions come because of the goodness that God brings into your life. And that's a healthy way to go about it. Those people that I just talked about, a lot of times, they're okay with the idea of forgiveness, but they struggle with receiving forgiveness from God. And they punish themselves here, and they punish themselves here, and they say, I'm not good enough, or I'm never going to do this again, or all these different. Guess what? You know what? Here's the thing. You're human, you messed up, you sinned, you get right with God. You're probably going to do it again. Maybe not that thing, but something else. Because if you think you're that perfect, and I know my mother's watching right now, and she considers herself, perfect at times, or at least that's what she said to me, okay? I know better, Pop knew better, we all know better, Mom, all right? But you're going to mess up again. Learn that humility, because in that humility of apologizing to the Lord and then learning to apologize to other people, you're going to grow, and God will grow you way more than He can without. If you harden your heart, you can't grow in the Lord. Last paragraph on page 53, it says this. Although this wicked plot to convict Jesus constituted history's greatest miscarriage of justice, it also led to history's most miraculous outpouring of mercy and grace. Jesus' sacrifice was the key to the Father's plan of redemption, offering undeserved forgiveness and restoring our communion with Him for all eternity. Here's a question, I think this will get some legs. Is God concerned with fairness? Oh, wrong side. Come on, people. I know you can answer this. Is God concerned with things being fair? What was that, Raina? No? Why? Okay. Serena says God's not really interested in fair. God's interested in executing his will, right? Is that a good way of summing that up? I did okay. I did okay with kind of bringing that right into. That's a good one. Okay. You guys missed a lot. She said a lot of things. It boiled down to God really wants to complete his will upon the earth. Now, Beth has a different viewpoint than me. She said that he is a just God. Who's right? Come on. Who's right?
Just doesn't exactly mean fair all the time.
Jim says just doesn't mean fair. Explain.
To be fair to somebody, you may, if you're just, I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but, you can, to be fair to someone, it doesn't mean you're exactly gonna be just, you're gonna, be fair how you treat people. Is that the right thing to do? Are you going at the right, goal in mind, or on the right direction for the right purpose? Or are you being fair? It's kind of drawing a line on the edge.
So what Jim is saying is fair and just are two different things. Fair isn't necessarily just, and just isn't necessarily fair. Jess Thurber says both. Just doesn't mean fair. Kathy says we may not think of it as just at the time it is happening, but then in hindsight we understand that it is. I want to challenge that too. Even in hindsight sometimes, when I think back about my life and how I was, there's nothing just to me about God's treatment of me. It's simply his grace. God had redemption on his mind when it came to Bill Kinney. I should have paid a much larger price for my sins than I did. Jesus took my sins, and now I'm not suffering the consequences. I have suffered some consequences, but eternally I'm not suffering those consequences for the sins that I committed. A parable like that? You want me to cite that one for you? You're talking about the 11th hour worker, right?
Yes.
Okay. In the 11th hour worker parable, there's an owner of a vineyard, and he goes out at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he gets a group of workers, and they agree on a set price for him to pay them. And they go work in the vineyard. Then he goes back out into the market again at 9 o'clock and agrees with the same price that he paid the people at 6 o'clock. It goes all the way to what they call the 11th hour, which really what it means is there's only one more hour left of work before dark. And he agrees to pay the 11th hour workers the same as he agreed to pay the first hour workers. The first hour workers didn't know that until he started paying the 11th hour workers the same as he was paying them. And the first hour workers got angry and went to the owner about it, and he goes, "What's the problem? We agreed on what I was going to pay you. What is it to you if I want to pay them the same?" Now, that's a little bit different because Jesus is using that as a vehicle in terms of the church. Because we'd like to think maybe the apostles have, like a higher seat in heaven than we do. Not the truth, everyone. Not the truth. We all receive the same payment. We go to heaven. Everyone get what I'm saying? So that's what he's using about that. But, the question we're talking about is God concerned with fair? Jim says no. Nita, what do you think? See, there's a lot of things in the Old Testament. The Bible says he loves fair weights and balances, right? Okay, so that's different, Jim. Why is it different?
That's dealing people with people. Fair with God and just with God you're talking about the weights and that stuff, that's people dealing with each other. God's gonna do some things that are just, that are really probably gonna be fair, I think.
So Jess Thurber says this, as a mother and bus driver, I learned that if both kiddos do the same thing, what's fair and just may be different for the two. One might need detention to learn the lesson. One might need a conversation. Who has multiple children? When you set up your household, do you have the same set of rules for them? Everyone, same set of rules? Jan, do you have the same set of rules for all the boys? We'll stop by at the office and see. But when you're raising them, do you have the same set of rules for each kid? You're supposed to. Why, Jim?
You can't treat one better than the other. You have to be fair with them.
You can't treat one better than the other.
But they all have different,
Are you talking about general rules? There's general rules, yes. Other rules, no. I'm trying to tell a 2-year-old what to do with a 7-year-old, what to do with a 7-year-old.
there's a big age difference between the kids, it's 5 years.
So, hold on. So what you're saying is that you go by an individual basis per kid? Generally, no. Okay, so what you're telling me is your interpretation of the rule for a certain kid is different than it might be for another kid.
Yeah, so like, I can't spank Josh if it doesn't do anything for him. So I make the rules like that. Mary, I can spank. And then we're good.
Okay, John and Mary getting two different sides here. Kathy says, I had the same set, whatever Pop said. Yeah, okay, Ma. Yeah, okay. Okay. Act like I didn't live in the house with you. Right.
Wrong is still wrong, and right is still right. But how each kid is handled with it, like she said, spanking for one, and then, the 15-year-old doesn't want to get spanked.
As a parent, when you're trying to enforce the rules, what do you want to do for that kid? Do you want to punish them, or do you want them to learn the lesson? Learn the lesson, right? So you give them a consequence that's effective for them learning the lesson. The consequence may be different. Can I tell you something? When they were little, you could spank Riley all day. He's not going to do a peep. Caleb would cry and cry and cry and cry. And then Riley learned to cry and cry because of Caleb, okay? Some parents like to put kids in a chair. I can't do that with Carson because he'll make up an imaginary world and have a blast for himself just sitting in a chair. Does everyone get what I'm saying? Like he has a good old time. So I put him in a labor camp. That's how and then he gets the picture. The interpretation sometimes of the consequence of the rules is different. And I think that's what we're talking about. When we talk about fair weights and scales, Jim, you're talking about person to person. You said that very aptly and correctly. But when we're talking about people to God, okay, is God more concerned with the justice or the restoration of relationship with people? He's interested in redemption. It doesn't mean if the person won't be redeemed and they choose not to, then yes, there's going to be consequence. But I've found that God generally lets their own sin as a consequence come upon them. You don't see the hand of God really move in punishment a ton here in the New Testament. People's own sin find them out. You can even see it in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament it happens quite a bit too, right? Let's go to the last page here. 2 questions. So let's read these verses. It's Matthew chapter 26, verse 57. So I'll get there quick and I'll read it. Then we'll be done. Then the people who had arrested Jesus led him to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of religious law and elders had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed at a distance and came to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and sat with the guards and waited to see how it all would end. Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus so they could put him to death. But even though they found many who agreed to give false witness, they could not use anyone's testimony. Finally, 2 men came forward who declared, "This man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus replied, "You have said it, and in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming in the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, "Blasphemy! Why do we even need other witnesses? We've all heard this blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they shouted. "He deserves to die." Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fists. And some slapped him, jeering, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you that time?" How did Jesus' silence and his words attest to his identity to the Messiah? Well, it goes back to some of these verses just above that question on page 54. It talks about the prophetically, these are the things that would happen, and these are the things that Jesus would do. He would be silent among his accusers, right? But here's the question. Why do you think the Sanhedrin reacted the way they did when Jesus answered the charges? Anyone?
They wanted to prove himself guilty, I guess.
Yeah.
Any answer would probably be the wrong one. This whole thing, every time I go through this, it boggles my mind. Satan was so happy about this, but it was God's original purpose for all this to happen the way it did.
Mm-hmm.
We got Jews and Gentiles on each side to make this happen, and you're still arguing about who was at fault that killed Jesus. And it just, the way, it just doesn't, it's amazing the way it flowed, but it didn't look like it flowed that way, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like it was very unusual.
Isn't it interesting that Jesus gives them the charge that they can take to the Jews so that they kill him?
Because they had to have it.
They had to have a charge to bring him before Pontius Pilate. And right here in Matthew, Jesus gives them the charge. Literally hands it to him on a plate. I find that really interesting because in this sense, God does away with justice and chooses redemption, knowing in advance that the death of Jesus would bring about the redemption of mankind. Does everyone get what I'm saying? And even though there was pain there, he put justice aside in place of grace. And I find that a lot of times in our lives, with the people in our lives, we would do a lot better. Doesn't mean we always do away with justice, but we would do a lot better if we teach grace than justice. Unmerited favor. Amen? Being a lot like the Lord when we do that. Well, let's pray. This was a technical one to get through, everyone, just like the last one was.
You know,
But
and
interesting.
When the Jews and Gentiles still arguing over that, you can't really answer it by what we got.
Mm-hmm.
You know, God decided this is how it was going to go. We're all guilty, I guess.
Jesus, we love you. We thank you that you chose grace and not justice. Jesus, we thank you that you chose to hang on the cross and not call 10,000 legions of angels to save you. Lord, I'm grateful for your sacrifice on the cross, and Lord, I ask that you'd move in our hearts in the same way for the people in our lives, for our wives and our husbands, for our children, for our brothers and our sisters, our moms and our dads, our aunts and our uncles, God, our cousins, that we would choose grace and not justice at times. That we would want to redeem the relationship. Lord, help us to listen to our spouses and to have grace for them. We love you. We praise you. We worship you tonight. And I thank you for moving here at CCAG. God, we thank you for 4 souls who gave their life to you on Sunday. What an incredible thing. Jesus, we love you and we praise you in your name. Amen. God bless you guys. Have a great night.